What if the most spiritual thing you could do today has everything to do with the person standing right in front of you? That's what we're going to talk about today in the book of James. Boy, the book of James is our next book up, and we just got done with Hebrews, and that book was incredible. James is great, too. That's what we're all about in the Small Steps with God, is talking about the Bible one small step at a time. I'm Jill from the North Woods, and let's go ahead and step into this letter of James. If you've been with me through the letters of Hebrews, you know what it feels like to sit inside of a long, carefully constructed argument. Hebrews is architecture. It builds, it layers, it takes everything step by step through the Old Testament sacrifice system and shows you how every piece of it pointed towards Christ. James is a bit different. James feels more like a conversation with someone who has been watching your life and has something to say. It's very practical, very direct, and sometimes is blunt, deeply pastoral. You know, pastors can be blunt as well. It doesn't mean that they're always couching things in softer terms. You know, you think about Proverbs crossed with a Sermon on the Mount, written by someone who genuinely loves the people he's writing to, but refuses to let them stay comfortable in where they are today. We're going through this book, and we are going to start that in the Bible in small steps, chapter by chapter and verse by verse. But what we want to do is look at basically the book itself. Who was it written by? Why was it written? What are the big themes that are going on? So that you can understand where the letter is coming from and maybe helps you hear the verses a little bit better. So first of all, who was James? It simply opens with James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. There's no title and no credentials here, no appeal to any sort of authority, just the name and the posture of as a servant. The most conservative commentaries will identify James as the brother of Jesus, the same James who became a leader in the church of Jerusalem, that they considered him to be the bishop of the church of Jerusalem, as it appears in Acts 15, presiding over the Jerusalem council, and who Paul called a pillar of the church in Galatians 2. What's remarkable about it is James is in the arc of this story. During Jesus' ministry on earth, the Gospels tell us his brothers didn't believe him. Remember, they came to haul Jesus away. You've been talking crazy. We're going to get you out of here. His family, other than Mary, did not believe him. His own family were trying to get him to stop. And now something happened. After the resurrection, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that the risen Jesus appeared specifically to James. And from that point forward, James became one of the most respectable and respected leaders in the church. The early tradition gave his title as James the Just, James the Righteous, because of his reputation for deep prayer, personal holiness, and genuine integrity. He was known as the man whose knees were calloused because he spent so many hours in prayer. It kind of makes me wonder that if you stood before the Lord Jesus Christ and scoffed at him, let's get you home before you hurt somebody, you didn't believe him, and then suddenly you get visited by the risen Lord, changes a man. And he probably feels all the things, grateful for what Jesus did, concerned that he didn't believe him when he was right here. And that would bring a man, I think, to his knees quite a bit. He's writing to scattered believers across the world. He doesn't introduce himself as the brother of Jesus, but calls himself a servant. And that word, a servant, is the idea of a slave, deliberate lowliness. The greatest honor James claims is not his famous connection to the Messiah himself. It is belonging to Jesus. And that tells you something about the man who you, like I said, have a background of, but who wrote this letter and expresses some feelings to it. If it's not that particular James, it's still a James who puts himself in that position. Let me say it that way. He addresses the 12 tribes of the dispersion, and that phrase will carry out of the Old Testament the weight of the 12 tribes of Israel. The language of God's covenant goes back to the sons of Jacob, to the story of Israel's founding itself. James is writing to Jewish Christians who are scattered now, in the Greco-Roman world, living outside of Israel and are spread out across the Mediterranean and beyond. And why were they scattered? Some of them, we know that there were people, Jewish people, who lived all over the place. But right now it's happening because of persecution. After the stoning of Stephen in Acts 7 through 8, a wave of persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and believers fled for the hills. They landed in new cities, new cultures, new social situation as outsiders, people with low social standing, and faced poverty because they probably just fled with the clothes on their backs. And they probably were also facing injustice and persecution from these other communities. So the background of this is that it shapes the tone of James entirely. James is not writing to a comfortable group of Christians trying to decide which Bible study to attend and what to serve for potluck the next night. He is writing to believers who are poor, pressured, scattered, and struggling to hold on to their faith in conditions that are genuinely hard. He is writing to people who know what it is to be either mistreated, persecuted, or just overlooked, and are uncertain about their own future. And so that's why this letter feels very urgent and why it's so practical. James is not doing a theology education for its own sake. He is trying to help people in what they actually need to do in order to survive in a huge degree of difficulty. So James sounds intense, and it has an edge to it, and it never lingers in its comfort at all. It pushes, it corrects, it uses language that sometimes sounds confrontational. Part of it is that the Jewish wisdom tradition that James is very familiar, people believe that he was a rabbi before he was a Christian, is that he's drawing from that rich wisdom tradition. The book of Proverbs, we haven't talked about yet, is not gentle either. It teaches wisdom of Israel plainly spoken because the author cared about the results, cared about the people's lives, that they be shaped by truth, not just educated. They have to change their lives because of what is true. And that's really where James sounds remarkably like Jesus. And if you read the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, and then read James, you'll notice that there are some echoing concerns. Concerns for the poor, warnings about anger or warnings about speech, the call for peacemaking, the critique of empty religion, the insistence on you must change how you live because of what you believe. Some scholars believe that James may have been present when Jesus taught some of those things. I mean, obviously, if your brother was going to do a huge speech and a big group of people, you're probably wondering what he is up to. James probably was close along, wondering what's going on. But whether or not that's the case, the family resemblance is unmistakable. His intensity is simply that James watched what happened when faith stay in people's heads, but it never reaches their hearts and it never reaches their hands. And he has seen the damage Christianity that is full of correct doctrine maybe, but is empty of compassion. He has watched communities recreate the world's hierarchies inside of the Church of God. And he has seen people that claim to trust the Lord and trust Jesus Christ while their speech tears people apart. They sit with their money untouched while their brothers and sisters go without. And James loves these people, and that's why he wants them to change, not because he's mad about it. He wants them to become something more, and he is not going to just let them just stay where they're at. So if you had to summarize the entire book of James in one sentence, it would be like, what does genuine faith actually look like in real life? Not a theological position or an education, not a faith that you would wear as a label, not a faith that indicates what kind of art you have in your house, or not a kind of faith that talks about which set of facts you agree with and which ones you don't. Instead, it's about a faith that is alive, visible. You haven't endured hardship, but how you treat other people who have nothing to offer you. How do you speak to other people? How do you handle your money? How do you respond in obedience when it costs you something? James is asking that question from every single angle in this letter, and he's not satisfied with the abstract answers. He wants real life change. So let's go through and take a look at some of the major themes that we're going to be talking about again and again as we go through James. James is very short, by the way. Understanding that these up front will help you understand the whole letter. Essentially, James opens up immediately talking about hardship and counts it as joy when you face trials of any kind, because the testing of the faith produces a patient endurance, the ability to remain calm under the weight of a collapsing world around us. James is not saying that trials are supposed to be pleasant or, gee, that stinks, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have trials? He is saying that they're not wasted. God uses that pressure to produce something in every believer that cannot be produced in any other way. I think we see that, right? People who live in comfort their whole times in life, they don't get that kind of resilience. And it takes hard times to teach us something, eternal about how God uses that pressure and grows us. And it's easy, I think, if faith doesn't discover how deep it goes. When trials are revealed, and that's what James' part is that revelation of spiritual formation. It's not evidence that something has gone wrong. Oh, gee, Jill, you're going through a tough time. What'd you do to mess up? It's not that at all. It is about shaping us into something new. Then he talks about wisdom. James has a big concern about wisdom throughout this letter, meaning something that it's not intellectual knowledge or being a theological expert at something or the other, but practical ability to live rightly. The Old Testament is filled with all kinds of wisdom. It's not just law and gospel, and it's not just obscure stuff. It's about how to live and knowing how to navigate life in a way that aligns with God's character and his purposes, and for believers to ask God for it. God gives generously without a reproach, without making you feel foolish for not even knowing that kind of thing. And in James' mind, the opposite of wisdom is the double-minded person. It says two souls is the actual Greek. A person who's torn by trusting the world and then trusting God. They're being pulled in two different directions, and that person is unstable in everything. Wisdom is about having integration, a unified heart that orients itself towards God. And then it goes on to the last part, and this is one of the sharpest pieces in this letter, is the subject of wealth and social people around us who do not have that kind of wealth. And he returns to it repeatedly in this letter. He warns about the rich being a temporary nature of security. I talked about that in the last book of Hebrews. We feel secure because I can pay my bills, I can fix the furnace if it breaks down. If something horrible, I just thought I broke my garage today, well, I guess I can fix that. And I get security by the fact of knowing that I'll have a retirement, and that's where your security comes. But if you have that kind of security, it's temporary. It's a temporary nature. And he condemns favoritism towards the wealthy inside the Christian community. He calls out the exploitation of workers and the corruption of justice based on wealth or the lack of wealth. We're not having an abstract commentary about social. James is describing what he's seen, that the early church and the surrounding culture are merging together. Wealth is creating hierarchies, and that distorts the community. The kingdom of God is supposed to run on different values. And the early church is supposed to be radical in the Roman world because it genuinely gathers rich and poor, slave and wealthy landowners, men and women, all sorts of people, and we're all pointing towards Christ. And in this particular case, the church itself is becoming more culturally normative in the Roman world. We are not treating people the same, even though it's a church made up of many people. He points out widows and orphans, the poor, those who have no social advocates in their system, and that we have to care for them because that is what authentic faith looks like. It's not saying that the rich have to become poor in order to, have a church that we expected to have. They shouldn't have any advantages. And in the Roman world, the rich had advantages. And they were put in leadership just for the whole sake that they are rich. And in this case, we're not supposed to have those particular kinds of advantages like that. We're supposed to care for the people that are most vulnerable in our church. And then James devotes more attention to speech than any of the other New Testament writers. He will give an entire chapter about this. Be slow to speak, slow to anger, bridle your tongue, don't speak evil against one another, and let your yes be yes. For James, speech is not just a little bit of part of our spiritual life. It is a window into our hearts. The person who can't govern their words and is not fully under the work of the Spirit. The tongue, as James will memorably say, is a small thing with an enormous destructive power, and it reveals what's actually inside of a person. And so I see people trying to control speech with laws. That's not how it's meant to be. In the United States, we have free speech. But does that mean that everything that creeps into our mind comes out of our mouth? I think about that a lot because I see people who profess to be Christians say some pretty stark things. And I think the church is, in this particular case, what James is saying is that it's a window to the soul. That person who has harsh things coming out of their mouth, it's showing a harsh heart. And the work of the Spirit needs to be there as well. He goes on to talk now about, at the end of it, about faith and works. And this is something that's mostly associated with James. People will often bring it up. And I think it's very often misunderstood. James' famous declaration that faith without works is dead seems to contradict what Paul was teaching, that we're all saved by faith and that work is done and that we cannot work towards our own salvation. That is absolutely true. But a careful look at commentaries will see them as complementary, not contradictory. Paul is fighting against the idea that people can earn their standing before God through religious performance, earn their salvation by their own efforts. And the answer is no. Salvation is by grace through faith. James is fighting something a little bit different. The idea that you can claim faith and showing no evidence of transformation. And that's the answer. It's not that you have to do works in order to have real faith. Real faith produces movement. It acts, it obeys, it responds to needs, and it takes risks. Paul will say we're not saved by works. James says real faith does works. So they're not competing against each other. They're complementing and completing each other. So we'll look at that when we get closer to it. And then authentic faith. For those who themes that are coming in, the difference between genuine faith and a limiting faith. James has no patience for a fake religion that impresses people outwardly. And Jesus was the same way. Remember, all you Pharisees walking around in your famous robe, people admire you and you just love how they give you the best seat in the house. That's not it at all. What he describes is a true faith plainly, visiting orphans, helping widows in their affliction, keeping oneself unstained by the world. Not these dramatic experiences that we see on stages. Not the impressive theological knowledge. I would love to be that theologian who can, I have logos. I spend a lot of times trying to shore up my own understanding of, whether it's theology or apologetics, but that's not it either. It's about compassion and integrity. That's what matters most. And so this letter really matters to us because James is writing to people in the first century who were scattered, were poor, were under pressure, and in many ways, the circumstances of his readers are very different from ours, particularly in the Western world and the United States. But the temptations are all exactly what James describes, completely the same. The temptation to favor being impressive over being genuine in our faith. The temptation to admire and put up into high standing the wealthy and the powerful and overlooking the widow and the orphan and the poor. The temptation to let faith stay inside the mind and never reach the hands. The temptation to speak carelessly against other people and never think about the spirit inside their own hearts. The temptation to accumulate anxiety, to accumulate fear, and not live like Christ taught us to live. And the idea to accumulate materials, essentially to assuage our own fears, maybe for those of us also who plan arrogantly, who drift towards the value of the culture without noticing that it's happening, admiring what the culture admires. James speaks to all of that, and very directly, no apologies, because he believes that the people are capable of something better, not through their own effort alone, but through the same God who gave them the faith to begin with. It's time they start learning to live that faith out. And so the letter of James is a mirror that is most useful when you stand in front of it for long enough to see what it is that he is talking about clearly and what you are doing to mirror what he is talking about clearly. So we walk through the letter of James. You can expect that James is going to ask a lot of questions that you might not be able to answer with any sort of fancy doctrine. He is going to ask us to hold up situations of the hungry person, the wealthy visitor, the community in conflict, a tongue that will not stop battering other people. And he asks you, what does your faith lead you to do here instead? It's uncomfortable at times, and that's on purpose. He loves his readers too much to leave them with a faith that stays theoretical. And underneath it all, underneath every challenge and every warning, is the idea that God is the Father of lights, whose every good gift comes from above, and that he gives wisdom generously to anyone who asks for it. And he is actively at work with his people, using his people to produce something real. That's the God that we follow through this letter. And the question is, when we ask ourselves that, is what does it look like when your faith actually lives out the gospel? And that's the question James is asking for all of us. All right, everyone, thanks so much. Appreciate you being out there. I'm excited to get into this chapter of James. We are getting towards the end of the New Testament. Appreciate you being out there, and I hope you're doing well. You can email me at jill@startwithsmallsteps.com. Thanks so much, and have a great day.